Welcome to Scenarios in the Energy Markets and the Impact on our Interconnected World. My name is Marcel Schultz and I'm the Executive Director of the European American Chamber of Commerce, Netherlands. And next to me is my colleague, Erin McKelvey, President and CEO of EACC Texas. Erin, welcome to the Netherlands.
Thank you, Marcel. It's a pleasure to be here in person with you to welcome our guests from both sides of the Atlantic to discuss energy and hear what insights our panelists will share. For those of you not yet familiar with the European American Chamber of Commerce, we are a network of 8 chapters, 3 in Europe and 5 in the United States. In total, we serve close to 800 members. The EACC is a non-lobbying, not-for-profit organization whose objective is to stimulate business development for our members and to facilitate networking and relationships between European and American businesses and professional organizations. Today's topic is relevant to all. It touches upon our energy security, and we see that reflected in the registrations for today, as both corporate stakeholders in the US, Europe, and the rest of the world, as well as officials from many governments, embassies, and consulates have joined up.
So we are very proud to have world-class speakers from both the Netherlands and Texas joining us here in the studio of our founding and presidential circle member, Loyens & Loeff. Therefore, I kindly introduce you to Mark Rehberger, partner of the firm's Energy and Infrastructure Practice Group. Mark has over 20 years of experience in corporate advisory, M&A and real estate law. His practice focuses on the energy and infrastructure sectors, including industry and logistics. I will now hand you over to Mark and wish you a wonderful program.
Thank you very much, Marcel. Thank you very much, Erin. So Loyens & Loeff is delighted to be co-hosting this webinar alongside the EACC. For those of you that do not know Loyens & Loeff, we are a full-service business law firm. We have offices around the globe in key financial centers, and as home markets we service the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg and Switzerland. We do that with over 1,100 legal professionals, and that makes us the second largest continental European law firm. I said we are full service, but we have a specific focus on 4 areas, and one of the most important of that is energy and infrastructure. For energy and infrastructure, we've put together a team of 60 professionals, legal experts in the areas of law that we feel are critical to clients in the E&I sector. And because we've brought that team together, we're able to service the clients with a fully integrated, multidisciplinary approach, and that works well to address the complex problems that the clients in this sector are faced with. Some of those problems will be touched upon in this webinar. There is, of course, also a large legal angle to that, to energy security. Think about investment screening mechanisms being put in place to protect vital infrastructure. Think about EU efforts and regulations to reduce our dependency on energy import. Think about force majeure clauses in contracts that may need more attention to deal with energy disruptions, and there is much more. But legal topics are not on the agenda of today's webinar. To sort of set the stage on what we are going to be focusing on, I've reached out to a number of clients and spoke to them about what is on top of their mind in relation to energy security. And it led to quite a lot of interesting conversations, diverse conversations. And I've summarized the responses in 5 bullets. So first, there are clients that say we recognize the changes in the geopolitical situation. We see that a lot has changed already, for more attention for LNG capacity, acceleration of investments in renewable energy. But what other shifts are to be expected? What do we need to? What can we expect? A second point, and multiple clients came up with that, which sort of surprised me because it wasn't on top of my mind. clients say, we know that IT plays also an important role in the whole energy supply chain. Is sufficient attention paid to cybersecurity aspects? The third point, perhaps more recognizable, there were clients that fear the physical vulnerability of important energy assets like offshore wind farms. And they were saying in case of sort of massive destruction, also underwater cables, pipelines, in case of massive destruction, what resources do we have left to supply our vital infrastructure like hospitals? A fourth item, a bit more specific for the Netherlands. There are, in the Netherlands, part of the country is below sea level. There are important energy assets built on land. Are they above sea level, or are they vulnerable in case dikes are attacked? And lastly, a fifth bullet, a more generic question that was also on the mind of quite a number of clients, just if the geopolitical situation deteriorates, at what point in time will our energy supply really be affected? So I hope this sort of sets the stage. I hope that the webinar will be able to provide some answers to these questions, or at least help our clients to further progress their thinking on these topics. I'm happy to hand over to Ora Cuellar, who will be our moderator for today. Ora is an Executive Vice President of Growth and Strategic Projects at Transatlantic. Ora is also the Honorary Consul of the Netherlands in Houston. And before joining Transatlantic, Ora led Shell's United States energy transition as a Vice President. Ora has lived in Europe, Asia, Africa, North and South America, which is quite unique, I think, and which makes Ora a person with a very inclusive worldview and deep appreciation for regional approaches to address climate change. Ora, we are very happy to have you here as our moderator, and please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and welcome everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here today and engaging with incredible world speakers, as well as having such a broad audience participating in the webinar. As the global agenda grapples with both challenges and broad opportunities to shape the future, the impact on our security is paramount. This seems largely impacted by world dynamics, including economic headwinds, cyber threats, climate change, and energy security. And today, we are very lucky to have incredible speakers, which I will introduce in a moment, who will be invited to offer their unique perspective on how we can set a path to continue to progress the world in an effective way while addressing the pressing issues around energy security in our time. So what I would like to do today is introduce each of the speakers one at a time and invite each of them to share a bit of their perspective. Each of the speakers will share with us some thoughts for about 5 minutes. And after that, we will open for a panel of Q&A. For the audience who is joining the webinar, you are welcome to submit your questions on the Q&A chat on the Teams link that you have. And the team here will help channel those questions to me, and I will certainly bring them as we have the open dialogue. So with that, let's get started and enjoy this intriguing dialogue. To start, I would like to introduce Mr. David Van Wiel, who is the Assistant Secretary General, Emerging Security Challenges for NATO. David holds the role of NATO's Assistant Secretary General for Emerging Security Challenges, advising the Secretary General on such challenges as their implications for alliance security. He also oversees the Emerging Security Challenges Division, which coordinates alliances' responses to new threats like cyber and hybrid risks, terrorism, disturbing technologies, energy security, and data policy. David, welcome. If I may please invite you to share some of your thoughts and insights with the audience.
Thank you very much, Aurora, and it's a pleasure to be here. So thank you for the invitation. Good afternoon, good morning to some of you on the other side of the Atlantic, and let me give you some prepared remarks on where we stand with regards to this very actual topic that we're dealing with now. But before I do so, I cannot speak to any audience without reminding ourselves that the Euro-Atlantic area is not at peace now, and that 18 months ago, President Putin decided to launch a war of aggression on a sovereign and free nation called Ukraine. And this is not just an assault on Ukraine itself, it's also an assault on our international rules-based order, on our security orders and our values. And this will have a lasting impact on our lives on both sides of the Atlantic. For us, it only highlights the importance of the transatlantic link. And of course, energy security is one of the very important topics that we deal with at NATO. So although NATO is not an energy institution, we do play a pivotal role in the current energy market dynamics. And I would like to consider 3 points with you with regards to this. The first point is that Europe's energy security is under strain and that critical infrastructure protection has become ever more important. It was already mentioned by Mark. Following the Kremlin's weaponization of energy supplies during the lead-up to and throughout this war of aggression against Ukraine, allies made a deliberate effort to reduce our dependency on Russian energy. And in doing so, we turned to reliable suppliers from within the transatlantic community. Norway, which is a NATO ally, stepped in to increase production and mitigate the shortfall in Russian pipe gas supply. Last year, in 2022, Norway supplied Europe with 115 billion cubic meters of natural gas through underwater pipelines connecting the continent to North Sea gas fields. These supplies accounted for roughly 1/3 of Europe's gas demand in that year. Additionally, LNG imports in Europe rose for 70%, 70, compared to 2021. Thanks to flexible LNG supplies from another key transatlantic partner, the United States. And Europe is now becoming the primary destination for US LNG exports, and this trend will continue. For example, Uniper from Germany recently signed a long-term LNG contract for shipments of US LNG until the late 2030s, a great demonstration of the importance of the transatlantic bond. But we've also seen a record growth of renewable energy coming into the markets. In 2022, wind and solar generated more electricity in Europe than gas did. Offshore wind generation has particularly promising prospects to expand, with new infrastructure planned to connect massive offshore wind farms to onshore facilities. But to ensure the security of these energy supplies, we need to enhance our critical infrastructure protection, particularly offshore, since the majority of new energy sources are coming from sea and by sea. NATO, as a maritime alliance, pays particular attention to maritime security, especially in the international waters where national jurisdictions end. At our recent summit in Vilnius in July, NATO leaders agreed to establish NATO's Maritime Center for Security of Critical Undersea Infrastructure within NATO's Maritime Command in the United Kingdom. And this center will enhance NATO's situational awareness and maritime presence for deterrence and defense purposes. It will support NATO's efforts to respond to threats to critical undersea infrastructure and ensure the security of our energy supplies. But we also established a critical undersea infrastructure cell here in Brussels to support the engagement between NATO allies, partners, but very important, also the private sector. We're creating a network as we speak that brings these key actors together and improves information sharing as well as exchanges of best practices. It will help us to identify, detect, and prevent risks to our infrastructure, much of which is offshore. We're also stepping up joint activities that include allies, partner, and the industry, such as training and exercises, where we simulate crisis scenarios and coordinate our responses. In fact, I just came from one of those. The second point I want to make, NATO itself is adapting itself to the energy transition. The current high price environment in the energy domain has strengthened the business case for low carbon technologies and accelerated the energy transition. Renewables are playing an ever-growing role in our energy mix in the military, and we're exploring innovative technologies from sustainable aviation fuel to hydrogen cells. We pursue these changes not because we're running out of fossil fuels, but because extracting and burning them poses liabilities both for the environment but also for our security. To quote a former Saudi energy minister, the Stone Age didn't end because we ran out of stones. We are making these changes to adapt to the evolving landscape and, in our perspective, from the security landscape. And with the understanding that most of our civilian vehicles may run on batteries or hydrogen in the coming decades, it's crucial that the military is a part of this energy transition. And that's why we're embracing the energy transition with a view to establishing common standards, reinforce interoperability with new technologies, and ensure that we do not replace our old energy dependencies with new dependencies on other players. At the Vilnius summit, allies agreed a mandate for NATO to develop an implementation plan for our energy transition by design, to create an alliance that is both greener and stronger. And we'll deliver on that by the time of our next summit, which will be in Washington, D.C. in July next year. And third and last point, to successfully address critical infrastructure, energy security, and energy transition, we need to play in a team with other organizations and with industry. In this interconnected energy world, NATO increasingly relies on links with other international organizations, such as the EU, the international energy agencies, as well as the industry. At NATO, we have a good picture of the risks and threats, including to critical infrastructure. But we need to better understand the consequences of these risks. For example, the impact of energy disruptions to the markets and supply security. At the same time, the industry has a good picture of the market trends and the impact of potential disruptions. But it could benefit from a discussion with NATO on security, risks to infrastructure, but also supply chain vulnerabilities and geopolitical risks in the context of the energy transition. Therefore, it's an area where cooperation with the industry on situational awareness can benefit both NATO and the industry. And another area is about developing innovative technologies, including for energy security and energy transition. Energy technologies such as alternative fuels, energy storage solutions, deployable microgrids, and AI-based energy management can significantly increase energy efficiency and enhance the resilience of our power networks. Over the past years, NATO has made a significant progress in bringing innovation to the forefront of its agenda by establishing a venture capital fund, the NATO Innovation Fund, and Diana, our accelerator network, which will help incentivize technology innovations and development, including in the area of energy resilience. In closing, let me just emphasize that today's energy markets are as interconnected as ever. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine and attempts to weaponize energy supplies had cascading effects across the globe, affecting both consumers and industry producers. It reminded us all of the importance of the infrastructure security and the need to focus on bringing more homegrown energy supplies from low-carbon sources to our markets to enhance our energy supply security, our resilience, and our sustainability. The Transatlantic link is key to addressing these challenges, and NATO is a well-established platform to bring together the key energy stakeholders from both sides of the Atlantic to make sure that our energy networks are well supplied, secure, resilient, and future-proof. I'll leave it at that for my opening remarks.
Thank you, David. I really appreciate it. Dr. Malika Ishwaran, Senior Economist and Policy Advisor for Shell International. Malika is Shell's Chief Economist. She advises on macroeconomics issues, economic trends, and related policy matters to shape Shell's long-term scenario outlooks. She leads the strategic engagements on energy transition with national and city governments across the world, notably a multi-year collaboration with the Chinese government. Malika, if I can ask you to please share your perspectives in relation to how the different scenarios in the energy markets are shaping our current world.
Thank you very much, Aura. Pleasure to be here. As you said, I am Chief Economist of Shell, but also privileged to be member of Shell's long-term scenarios team. So this is an outfit that has been part of Shell for over 50 years now. And the idea there is to that the scenarios help provide a tool to think through how the world and the energy system might evolve over the course of decades, and how in that face of that kind of uncertainties that the world faces, the energy system faces, how how can Shell make better decisions? So that's sort of the purpose of the team. So I spend a lot of time looking at long-term trends and understanding how those might drive the direction of travel, as well as the uncertainties that might cause deviations from that direction of travel. Just like to say 3 points, and then hopefully there'll be spark some questions and thoughts from the audience. First and foremost, we're seeing three sort of key mega trends, if you like, emerging in the world around energy, or related to energy. First is we're seeing that energy prices themselves are being volatile. Now, this was before even the Ukraine crisis. This was something that we anticipated. As you draw down a fossil-based energy system and you build out the new low-carbon renewable system, this decade is likely to be a period of sort of supply inelasticity, if you like, which means that even relatively minor disruptions in the market will be sort of manifest themselves in disproportionately large energy price movements. So we're seeing that play out, not just in the Ukraine context, which is a huge disruption, but even for other more minor events. The second mega trend is that climate change continues, and we are seeing acceleration of some of these impacts. And we fully expect that over the course of this next 10 years, the world will breach 1.5 centigrade. Maybe not consistently, but we'll have years where the temperature rises higher than 1.5. And then the third sort of mega trend is technology. Not just low carbon technologies, but just technologies around automation, AI, digitization will absolutely revolutionize how energy is produced, is transported, and then is eventually used. So against these, the second point I'd like to make is that against this backdrop of these mega trends, we see an emerging mindset amongst governments around energy security. It started, the security mindset, if you like, started following the financial crisis, where countries then started to look and think about how they could make their economies more resilient to external forces. We saw the pandemic and then the Ukraine crisis sort of amplify this focus on security, whether that's energy, economic, health, or social security. Now, what we see is that that's manifesting itself in ways that are quite meaningful and substantive for the energy system. The two sort of key manifestations that we see that are relevant. Firstly, there's a fragmentation of the global geo-economic system. We're seeing more regionalization, more inward-looking policies that prioritize national self-interest, and we're seeing sort of a slowdown, if not a sort of slight stalling of the momentum towards globalization that we've had over the last decades. So that's one manifestation. The second we're seeing is that the world is moving towards a more competitive positioning. And that's quite significant in the climate and energy transition context, because we've always assumed a collaborative energy transition, that the world comes together to deal with a problem like climate change, which is a global problem, and you collaborate your way out of it. But we're seeing now there's more competition, if you like, rather than collaboration in countries dealing with each other. So on the third and last point, I would say that our scenarios explore these mega trends and these sort of emerging security conscious mindsets. And the thing that we find that the three things that sort of come out across our two scenarios. So we look at two scenarios that play out these trends and uncertainties in very different ways. Both scenarios have energy transition accelerating. So the energy transition is here to stay, despite all these trends. In fact, the energy security mindset drives a sort of a quicker shift, if you like, away from energy imports, which tend to be fossil imports, towards more domestic resources, which tend to be renewables, particularly in the developing and emerging economies of the world, which are the really growing energy markets. So again, just having that energy security lens accelerates this transition towards low carbon. So that's one thing. But the downside of all of this is that the pace of that acceleration is not enough to get to the goal of the Paris Agreement. So you need something more. And our second scenario explores how the nature of competition between countries can help deliver that goal. A competition that is based on competing on innovation, on producing better and better low carbon products, solutions, fuels, will get us there. Whereas measures that then move towards protectionism For example, by restricting access to markets, by restricting with the flow, by restricting supply chains. These kind of the more protectionist competition will sort of introduce inefficiencies into the system and basically stalls some of the progress. So again, there is a message here about competition being good, which you'd expect an economist to say, but at the same time, the nature of competition staying away from the vicious cycle unleashed by a protectionist force, but instead competition around innovation and technologies can actually move the world towards the Paris Agreement goal. So I'll stop there, and hopefully it's sparked a bunch of questions from people. Thank you, Ara.
Great. Thank you, Malika. Really appreciate it. And now let's go to Dr. Gabe Collins. Gabe Collins is the Baker Botts Fellow in Energy and Environmental Regulatory Affairs at Rice University's Baker Institute. He was previously an associate attorney at Baker Hostler LLP and is the co-founder of the China Signpost Analysis Portal. Collins has worked in the Department of Defense as a China analyst and as a private sector global commodity researcher, authorizing more than 100 commodity analysis reports, both on private clients and for publications. Gabe, it's great to have you here. I will invite you to share some of thoughts with the audience.
Thank you for having me, and it's great to be with y'all. So I'll try to keep my remarks fairly compact here. One of the things that I think is a really big theme that permeates a lot of the moves we're seeing globally is we'll talk about energy transition sometimes in a more abstract way, but the reality is you have to survive today in order to keep transitioning tomorrow. And we see this animating a fair amount of national behavior. When we look at energy decision-making, and especially decision-making as pertains to sourcing, there's a couple of different ways to look at it. And this is one, I think, where, especially when you get American companies and the American government also involved on different levels, is a lot of our partners tend to think in very government-led ways. And here in the United States, everything is very dramatically shaped by the private sector. And then you'll often have the government kind of follow along. I think for instance, if you look at our LNG export position, that in our crude oil export position as well, it would be an example of that. And so sometimes we talk past each other a little bit, but we end up making things work. And I think one of the things that is really core as we think about this, what some of the other speakers have referenced, we see growing securitization, we see more volatility in energy prices, we see all these different waves kind of shaking and buffeting the energy boat, is really coming back and anchoring ourselves in physics and thermodynamics. What you're really looking for, you're looking for energy density, you're looking for reliability, and you're looking for scalability. And something that often tends to result from the interplay of these, if things go right, is you also get affordability. And this is something obviously in Europe right now, when we've seen TTF gas spike and the other commodities follow it, people are acutely aware of. But one of the other things it illustrates is the cross-regional impact of some of the things that are going on. Like, we have discussions very frequently with our European partners where it's like, hey guys, you sourcing gas, particularly on the spot market, may avoid locking you into long-term contracts, but there's real implications for energy transition efforts in the developing world, because among other things, you're forcing certain countries into a position where they basically have to choose either between natural gas that they want to use but they can't afford, energy poverty, or in some cases domestic coal resources. I think India and Pakistan and Indonesia really jump out on this account. And if you go long enough with volatile prices and high prices, you can actually end up with outcomes that aren't necessarily desirable, like locking in coal use that could go for another 30 or 40 years if you're building a plant today. One of the other things I think that is really important to think about is, first of all, some of the things that we see, when you think about the fragmentation, some of this, undoing of the veneer of globalization that we've operated under, in some ways, economically, a lot of this energy decision making, we do have windows of great collaboration. You think about, for instance, the creation of the IEA in the wake of the 1973 oil embargo and so forth. But a lot of the time, you think of Winston Churchill's favorite or famous remark about Russia, where it's like watching a bulldog fight underneath a rug, where you don't fully know what's going on. You just hear the growling and the snarling. In a lot of the energy space, there's strong echoes of that, where it's really been a competitive knife fight for a very long time. And it's just, we've had events more recently in the world, whether it's been certain political shifts in the United States, whether it's the Ukraine war, the COVID pandemic, and other things, where it really pulls off the veneer, and the competition that in some ways was there for a long time is now much more nakedly obvious out in the open. And we have to, find ways to be able to deal with that and work through it. And when we think about countries sort of turning to a more security-based mindset, the real challenge with that in an energy transition environment is it does mean more renewables to a certain extent, but especially for the largest energy consuming countries, it often means more coal use as well. If we look at the models, for instance, that are emerging in both China and India, you have massive renewables growth, but especially on a capacity utilization adjusted basis, you have even more massive additions to coal capacity and very significant increases in coal usage, the same way that gas and renewables are effectively complementary goods in the United States and also to some extent in Europe. For other parts of the world and some of the more emerging markets, it's a coal and renewables relationship, and that has real climate consequences. And so to sort of, I guess, close out here is, when we kind of come back to the physics and thermodynamics, and you think about the density, reliability, and scalability, one of the things that has probably gotten short shrift so far in the conversation is actually the role of nuclear. And, I'll certainly be curious to see what the kind of audience questions we might have, because it's a research area that's starting to really ramp up and become active for us. And, with that, I'd reserve the balance of my time and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe, and thank you for the three of you to set up the context for a very rich dialogue. So I would like to start kind of bringing a bit of what all of you spoke about, which touched certainly in the political environment, economic implications, what is happening today versus the long term. And the first question I would like to ask you is, what adaptations are you seeing today in the global energy markets in response to the shift on the political dynamics? May I ask, perhaps Malika, would you like to start? What do you see today happening?
Sure. So I think we're seeing two things. So the short term versus the longer term trend. So I think the short term energy security, obviously everyone has seen, was mentioned, energy prices in Europe spiked last year, and they still remain relatively higher. And so you are seeing a sort of a scramble, if you like, for resources, energy resources to meet needs today. So, in the real immediate term. But I think that takes away from the fact that what's going on in the longer term, where you're seeing these energy security considerations driving thinking and driving a pivot towards low carbon, more domestic, more resilient energy sources. So we certainly see that in Europe, that there is a real shift to see how can you speed up the energy transition in a way that reduces and can fill the gap left by sort of Russian gas and oil from the European market. So we're seeing that, but again, the pivot. So it's a tale of two stories depending on which timeline you're looking at, and both are playing out in parallel to meet the needs of the citizens today, as well as the needs of the citizens as is seen through energy resilience and security in the longer term.
Thank you. Gabe, anything to add?
No, I fully agree with that. I would say that by using energy as a weapon, President Putin has changed the energy landscape and has changed the market, and it has changed for good. So waking up to that reality, it means that for Europe, the self-reliance that Malika mentioned is very high on the agenda. And of course, from a NATO security perspective, we applaud that. It also means that we'll be looking further into these reliances and what other dependency have we been building up that might be detrimental to our security in the medium and the long term. And of course, here I'm talking about our dependency when it comes down to the electrification of our society on raw materials and batteries coming out of China. So I would say that 3 years ago, it was very hard to bring the security aspects of energy to bear because people thought that economics would dictate how dictators make their decisions. I think now we've woken up to the reality that they don't work by economic rules, or not only by economic rules, and that has implications for our energy infrastructure, our dependencies, and how we make sure that we have reliable fuel sources in the future.
Gabe?
Certainly, and I completely agree that Putin upended the energy landscape. There were already a lot of these forces taking shape before. The one thing I guess I'm somewhat less sanguine about is how this will ultimately turn out. Because, for instance, that coal renewables nexus that I've referred to earlier in many parts of the world, particularly outside of the U.S. and Europe, I think it's still not fully clear how that plays out, in the sense that you're definitely taking 10 steps forward, but the question is, if coal is your system balancer that offsets intermittency, how many steps do you take backwards from an emissions perspective? And so this is, I guess, where we really come back to nuclear and gas. And for everyone on here who's from Europe, I'll fully admit my American bias that we think we're a wonderful LNG supplier. There's not always full agreement on each side of the Atlantic insofar as the merits of long-term contracting. But one other thing, I think, in addition to nuclear, maybe not getting quite enough emphasis in the conversation, is having a more frank admission that gas is an energy transition fuel beyond what we sometimes see in the rhetoric. And that if there were a decision made today that said, okay, gas is something that's probably with us for the next 20 to 25 years, and we're willing to sign more long-term contracts, you open up more supply in the upstream, you structurally are likely to see prices come lower, and you can actually accelerate pushing coal out of the energy system globally. I mean, we've already seen this model play out in the United States, and it's something that would be beneficial globally, and it buys time for some of these other technological and other changes that others have referred to really percolate through the system.
So from Adaptations today of what we see, let's go not too far in the future, let's just go to next year. One of the questions from the audience is, in the US and in EU, we will have elections next year. What scenarios do you see as that are possibilities playing out that are shaping the context of what we're speaking about? Gabe, may I ask you to start?
I was going to say, yeah, this one, since it may be more controversial, well, I'll probably make everybody mad with my response here. So one of the things that is interesting, and I'll sort of step through a couple of different levels. So first of all, if we think about surviving today to keep transitioning tomorrow, obviously the US as a natural gas exporter is very important to that. That's something that I strongly suspect will endure on a bipartisan basis in some ways, to the extent that the federal government's able to be a facilitator. If you had a different type of administration than we have today, that some of those trends might actually accelerate. And so I think there it's something that's sort of on balance neutral to maybe positive. If you're thinking about the impacts on our domestic transition efforts, that one, again, you see things on the state level. For instance, here in Texas, we've seen more opposition during this most recent legislative cycle to some of the wind and solar power facility siting. But I think here it's an interplay. There is some of it that's ideologically motivated. I think some of it is also more practically motivated, where you have folks who aren't used to having energy infrastructure in their backyard are now having to actually confront those situations. And so we're going to have a political workout period, but I think these industries, by and large, they've become big enough, and you actually have enough of the benefits concentrated in red states that even if we were to have a political changing of the guard to a much different type of administration, there would probably still be broader support than you might expect at first glance.
Thank you. Any comments further, David or Malika?
No,
Sorry, David.
Please go ahead, Malika.
No, I was just going to give a little bit more of the European perspective. So, by the way, I agree with Kate that, I mean, we do worry from here, based in London, what the U.S. change in the policy landscape, what could possibly happen post next year's election. But again, seeing the benefits of measures like the IRA spread across the political spectrum in terms of states does give it a bit more resilience, if you like, than you would expect. In Europe, I think the elections obviously are coming up for the Parliament and the Council. And again, we see less uncertainty here in terms of the direction of travel. I think European policy has been established, has been taken forward, is relatively advanced. And so again, there are elections, there will be changes to certain approaches and certain types of policies, but overall, not really expecting the direction of travel and the pace at which Europe is traveling in this direction to materially change.
Let me just very briefly add to that. As a transatlantic alliance, of course, we're very much occupied with elections, both in Europe and the US. It's part of our democracies. It makes them resilient, and that also sometimes means that you have some course corrections. But let's remind everyone that NATO is now 74 years old and has survived many different elections and different people in different places. So I'm pretty sure that we'll be here, whatever the outcome of whatever election in the US or Europe will be next year or the years after. On energy transition, I think the previous speakers have said it right. This is a plan that's being set in motion, and it's making business sense now. For us, it makes sense from a security perspective because it decreases our reliance on other players and increases our resilience. So I think that whatever will happen politically, that these trends will continue in a NATO context.
Thank you. On that note, I wanted to double click a bit more on the energy transition topic. Each of you spoke and mentioned it in your opening remarks. Malika, you spoke about one of the scenarios in the energy transition impacting the pace and commenting on competitions. David, you spoke about how for NATO it's essential to have a common standard and adapt as the energy transition continues. And Gabe, you spoke about elements including LNG and your views on how that could be a transition fuel. Could we deep dive a little bit further on what do you see specifically in the angle of the transatlantic relationships of how the transition between our current energy systems, both production and consumption of energy, how do you see evolving them given the context of the political landscape that we have been speaking about? So, David, maybe...
Yeah, if we look from a NATO perspective, then one of the things that has made NATO a great military alliance is the fact that we are interoperable, that all nations are able to communicate with each other, use the same fuels, have the same standards when it comes down to ammunition. That makes the sum of the individuals bigger than the individuals themselves. So as we venture into this energy transition, for us, one of the big challenges is how do we make sure that whatever we use as energy in planes, in ships, in things that roll, in trucks, in barracks, in deployed military, that we all use the same, that we don't end up with allies relying heavily on hydrogen when it comes down to what are now diesel trucks. Others are still reliant on diesel, and the third category is electric, be it the US or a European system. So for us, that is a big challenge. How do we design that future fuel mix? And then at the same time, we are very reliant on civilian infrastructure when it comes down to our energy mix. So already now, the military doesn't own refineries. We don't drill oil wells. We are reliant on civilian logistics to actually provide us with the energy that we need. So we are looking at the civilian transition, and we're trying to adapt quickly where it is applicable for the military. Our challenge is, of course, that we look very, very far ahead. We are now thinking about buying fighter jets that we will take a decision on in 10 to 15 years that will then come into service another 10 years later. And by that time, we will live in a different world. So we need to think about how we remain flexible in the systems that we buy, whilst at the same time being very closely adjoined to the civilian transition.
Thank you. Malika?
Yeah, go ahead, Malika.
Yeah, no, I think from our perspective, it's really clear that both Europe and the US are putting a lot of policy effort and financial support behind the energy transition. That has to be a good thing in terms of driving down costs of technologies and fuels that you need, in driving up learning rates and how do you deploy and diffuse them. And the difference between the two sort of regions is around, the extent to which you use carrots in the form of subsidies, or you use a mix of carrots and sticks in terms of subsidies with some regulatory requirements. But I think in general, this policy push and support by both sort of very large economic powerhouses, if you like, is important to accelerate the transition. And the benefits will be not just in these jurisdictions. The benefits will be for all, because it will drive down the costs and speed up the adoption of these technologies across the world. We saw that happen with solar. We are seeing that happening with a bunch of other technologies. So again, sort of seeing that sort of play out in a very positive way. I think the cautionary note that I would ring again is around competition. I think putting in protectionist measures such as local content requirements or restrictions on the movement of the best-in-class products across the world will just add inefficiencies and slow down the benefits that you can get, the world can get from the efforts that the US and EU are putting in getting the transition off the ground.
Thank you. Gabe?
Yeah, and I think there's so just to build off of both what David and Malika are saying, one of the issues that we've been confronting with some of our research, and we'll hopefully have a piece in The Economist here in a few weeks on this. I'm trying to draft it in a way that I don't get totally crucified for, is basically explaining, among other things, that at least over the, if we're looking on a 5, 10, 15-year time frame, we think about this idea of trading one dependency for another. And by this, I mean Chinese hardware. If you're looking at wind turbines, you're looking at solar panels, you're looking at electric vehicle components. And one of the things that I think makes these technologies a little bit different than oil, if you guys are my oil supplier, I have to buy from you every single day. And so it's a really constant, close, and intimate dependency. If you're my solar panel or battery supplier, I buy from you once every 10 or 20 years. So I think it's a more attenuated type of dependency, but the political rhetoric takes you somewhere else. And one of the things that we're exploring is thinking about ways where you can embrace hardware that does come from what I think is a global best-in-class supply chain, flaws notwithstanding, in finding ways to make it secure. For instance, you take the Chinese solar panel, but you need some sort of open source inverter software, and you need any kind of data link or internet connecting devices would need to be from somewhere trusted. There's very nuanced conversations that, if we're serious about some of these energy transition technologies, other than gas and nuclear, it's going to lead you back to China very quickly. And we have to ultimately find very concrete ways to deal with that.
Gabe, thank you. It actually ties perfect to the next question here that I have. Several of you touched into supply chain, infrastructure, investment. Could we deep dive a little bit into what are your views on how the current economic investment environment is being shaped, again, by the political context that we have discussed, the changes in the energy security system, as it relates to, several of our members here on this webcast come from companies from the Transatlantic parts of the region. Could we deep dive into investments that you see being impacted by the context that we have been discussing in this webinar? So,
can I raise a quick point? It's more of an economics point that I think may overshadow some of this, is to think about how a higher interest rate environment influences renewables investments. Because when you think about the yield that you historically get if you invest in an oil field or a gas field or a coal mine, your rates of return are often quite high. And so sort of thinking about how do renewables look as we go from a quantitative easing world where if you have a 0% interest rate or negative interest rate in Europe, a 3 or 4% return on a project might be a pretty attractive yield. But if you're in a 5 to 7% baseline interest rate world, how does that shift market participants' willingness to pursue these types of projects? And the biggest reason I bring this up is more, I think, for the US side than the European side, where, in Europe, the government stick is wielded in a pretty big way. And there are market carrots as well, but in the United States, it's much more carrot-based, where if the market terms aren't right, you may not see the level of activity.
thank you. Any thoughts, Malika?
Yes, yes. So, a couple of reflections here. Firstly, when we look at the data on trade and investment flows, we're not really seeing a massive pullback, if you like, in the patterns of these flows as in response to the geopolitics. So you're seeing some movement, but I think, in my view, it's probably the rhetoric getting ahead of the actual changes on the ground that you're seeing. I think you're seeing some strategic sectors where you have these kind of restrictions and sort of a chilling effect on investment and trade flows, but it's not yet more broad-based than that. So that's the first thing to note here. But I think it is worth saying that this kind of fragmentation that we're now looking at in our scenarios, it puts up barriers and hurdles and adds economic costs to doing business. The political rhetoric is one thing, but then it does affect the bottom line. Particularly, I speak from the perspective of a global company that operates across borders. So it just creates a lot more administrative costs and burdens to operating internationally, and that's not a good thing for anyone in terms of growth and development. So again, the geopolitics are where they are, but I think making sure that they remain targeted and are on key areas and issues and sectors that are of strategic importance, that do have that kind of sensitivity and prioritization in an energy and wider security context, but don't sort of spill over unnecessarily into other areas where they don't deliver any particular outcome that's desired, but just add in a lot of costs and burdens.
Thank you.
And the friction.
And if I can add to that, because of course I'm the spoiler in this whole story, because I bring the geopolitics into this. But we have seen that these have been underappreciated in the market for the past decades, right up until the 22nd of February. We have been writing reports on the manipulation of gas storages by Russia in Western Europe, and we have been laughed away by economists right up until the top level in governments. Now we see what the effects of that are. So we do need to take this seriously into account, and that the markets are not heavily responded to that doesn't surprise me, because the markets are still not preoccupied with this. They would like it to go away and we can go back to the norm. What I'm stating is the normal is not coming back. We are entering an area of strategic competition. Russia and China have aligned their views. We see the BRICS now being instrumentalized as a partner. So there are tectonic plates shifting, and that's what we need to take into account. So as I said, we're here as a platform to have that discussion, because there's a lot that we don't know that industry can tell us about the implications, and that can allow us, as was said, to make smart choices and not to create unnecessary frictions. Whilst at the same time, us being able to point out that actually the sabotage of a pipeline is a risk that you need to take into account when you make the investment, which has not been done when it was built. So I think if we align the two worlds more on a more permanent basis, I think we make better and safer choices whilst keeping the economy, the global economy, as open as we can. Because of course I agree from that point of view that the less friction, the more we all benefit.
Yeah.
So there's a quick
Gabe.
quick positive observation, then a quick, maybe more negative one. So the positive observation, and this is to Malika's point that we don't really see trade flows dropping off much, is I think that there's hundreds of years of human history behind this. I mean, think about what a trading ship looked like in the 16 or 1700s. You had a ship hold that was full of goods, and you had a bunch of cannons sticking out of the side because you knew you had to sail through waters with pirates and bandits and other things to get from port A to port B. And trade still flourished. You could get spices from Indonesia and Europe and all kinds of other things like that. And so, I think we're more adaptable sometimes than we give ourselves credit for when these shocks first come through. The more negative observation, and this is something we're a little concerned about, is when you think of the impact of additional frictions being introduced to the system, is it can become something where scale has sort of these self-spiraling, snowballing benefits, in the sense that if you're a smaller country who's maybe more on the periphery of the system, even if you're very populous, you think of, for instance, like a Pakistan or a Bangladesh, where you're subject to all the shocks, but you don't really have the scale to absorb or deal with them. It can create tremendous crises internally and, real humanitarian pressure and other things. Whereas if you're among the world's handful of terror states that can kind of speak internally with one voice, and I say this slightly tongue-in-cheek as an American, given what's going on here right now, but if you think about China, India, Russia, the United States, you have these large titanic entities that can sort of speak and move in a relatively unitary way, and it gives you some level of advantage if you're in a more fragmented, high-friction world. And so I think seeing how that plays out may be something that's very relevant in the coming years.
Thank you. As we're coming close to the end of our webinar, I would like to end up with a question from the audience around collaboration. And the question is, in your opinion, how could we improve our relationships to increase collaboration to address the current energy challenges that we have been discussing? If you have a magic wand, what would you do to strengthen those collaborations? So, Malika, perhaps you can start?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, especially against the backdrop of what we have. But I think strengthening the collaborations by being targeted on, on where is it that there are genuine disagreements, which there are, and there are legitimate disagreements, and where is it that the world really needs to come together to address a problem. Whether that's climate change, which is global, it doesn't really matter which country, chooses to mitigate the most or least. The world as a whole has to decarbonize. Or it's issues around things like pandemic, which again is a global health issue. So there are some set of issues that are global, that require global action, have global impacts, and those are where need to be sort of prioritized, identified, and collaboration sort of instigated in that. I mean, it's encouraging to me that despite all the tensions that we're seeing play out with US and China, climate change is seen, and energy transition is seen as an area where the two countries can join forces. So again, I think that's what you need to do. Be clear-eyed about problems that require global collaboration and solution, and prioritize them.
Thank you. Gabe, if I can ask you for some short words, and then I'll go to David.
Certainly. So I think in many ways, an idea of global level collaboration is, honestly, generally speaking, an illusion. I think as we approach these problems, we need to tighten our collaborative bonds with like-minded partner countries. This is certainly our friends in Europe, our partners in Asia, and others who are like-minded elsewhere in the world. And we have to accept that, particularly with the US-China relationship, it's going to be about competition, and that steel sharpens steel. There's two ways to get to an outcome if we want to use climate change as our issue of focus. One is to try to collaborate and go in circles around each other. The other is to actually push each other really hard competitively, where even if we're pursuing transition efforts for various reasons, steel sharpens steel, and at the end of the day, you can have an outcome where, even if it's because you were after each other, you ultimately reduce emissions, and that's something the world will benefit.
Thank you. David, to close us off.
I fully agree with the previous two speakers. I would just add that as we're entering this era of strategic competition, and it's our rule-based international order and our values-based system that's at stake, we do need to collaborate with like-minded nations to make sure that in the areas that are important for us, in standard setting, in security-related issues, that we see eye to eye. And the transatlantic bond is crucial to make sure that we have enough critical mass to get that done.
Yeah. Thank you. With that, I would like to pass the word to Marcel and Erin, and I would like to thank you for participating in this interesting panel.
Thank you.
That concludes today's program on scenarios in the energy markets and the impact on our interconnected world. A big thank you from the EACC network to our host, the moderator and the panel who have done an excellent job, as well as to our members who have made these programs possible. If you would like to be connected to one of today's participants, feel free to reach out to us and we will forward your request. If you're not a member and you would like to receive more information, please reach out to Erin or myself. The next EACC Netherlands program is on Wednesday, November 15 on doing business in the US, and the day after we welcome a delegation of secretaries from the state of Florida. Erin, what's coming up in Texas?
Well, the EACC Texas welcomes you to join programs next week with Siemens to discuss the future partnership of academia and business, and a Transatlantic Tech Showcase webinar on innovative software products by EACC member DevPark in Poland, in partnership with Tech Ranch in Austin. We also look forward to welcoming the Ambassador of Spain to the U.S. in Texas on November 7th, and hope you will join us there as well.
So please check the EACC newsletters and calendars for more information and registration. We wish you a nice rest of the day and look forward to seeing you back soon.